Well, my name is Ian Smith. I'm generally regarded as a bit of a rebel, and many people won't have contact with me simply because they can say they've had contacts with this dreadful man who defied the rest of the world, and particularly the British government. But that doesn't worry me because I have a clear conscience. I think that's what's important in life. My father came to the country as a young Scot. They lived in Hamilton, just outside Glasgow. Hamilton Academicals, which was a great, not Hamilton Academicals, Glasgow Rangers and Glasgow Celtic. Those were the great soccer teams in those days. Well, my mother's father came to fight for the British in the Boer War. And the British encouraged people who had come to the Boer War to go north and settle. Many of them went and settled in Kenya, in the so-called White Highlands there, where they used to grow coffee, some of the best coffee in the world. And a number of them came to Rhodesia and settled there because that was part of Rhodes's great dream of creating a red route from the Cape to Cairo. And that was part of what Rhodesia always believed in and wanted to support. So it was that brought my mother's father, who was a mining engineer in Cumberland, and he was encouraged to go north, so he went as far as Rhodesia and stayed there. My father was a young Scot. Him and he had a few brothers. The other brother went to America, and he came to Rhodesia. And they said they would swap stories and see if there was any preference to either of these two places. And maybe the one could go and join the other. But in the end, they both decided to stay where they were. The one in the United States, the one in New York, and my father in Rhodesia. And that's how they came in those early days and established themselves. Well, to begin with, I was just an ordinary backbencher in Parliament. I was the youngest person ever to go into the Rhodesian Parliament. I was 29 years old. And it so happened that in my little hometown of Selukwe, which was a big mining camp, there were people who said, excuse me, look, surely you don't expect us to vote for this chap Ian Smith. We remember him when he was in junior school here. And now you're asking me to accept him as my Member of Parliament. Well, it so happened there were a few of my colleagues in the pub at the same time when the nominations had gone forward, who said to me, you know, when he decided to go and fight for the war for Britain, and that was a number of years ago, you didn't complain then, did you? What's your case now? Well, obviously they did not have a case, and that pretty quickly scotched that one, and we heard no more from those people because of my friends who'd been with me as part of the war. So that fixed that one up pretty smartly. But I repeat, I became the youngest Member of Parliament, and I stayed in that position for a while until the question of federation came up. And I remember speaking to Sir Godfrey Huggins, who was our Prime Minister at the time, who was the oldest member. He represented the country which was the oldest and most loyal member of the Commonwealth. In that World War, we had more Rhodesians serving in the forces, proportional to population, than any other country in the Commonwealth. And I remember hearing Huggins say once, when we were out having tea in the break, that he had been told by the British, we like what you've done, we've got no problems with you, unlike so many of the other colonies who we have constantly to provide finance for and assist, you've always proved that you can stand on your own feet. And what we want to do is to spread your philosophy and your actions to these other countries. And because of that, we decided to go into this federation. I had a lot of my old friends who supported me in going into this federation on that basis, believing that it was going to strengthen the whole concept of Britain in that part of the world, bringing together southern Rhodesia, northern Rhodesia as it was then called, which had the famous copper belt, which was one of the richest copper mines in the world. And they also, just to the north of them, they had cobalt, they had diamonds to the north, to the Congo. And those were all things which were part and parcel of trying to help to assist in establishing Britain's authority there, and especially, as I have already mentioned, Cecil John Rhodes's dream of creating a red route from the Cape to Cairo. So it was that which motivated me, and which helped me to agree to go into this federation. But I remember asking a simple question: but what happens if the federation breaks up? We have been told, and you've told us, and our Prime Minister has told us, that this is equivalent to Dominion status to independence. So we've got virtual independence. And moreover, written into the Constitution is that the federation cannot be dissolved. Well, I said, what happens if, for some reason or other, the British change their minds? And I think history proves that they sometimes do this. Can't we then say, right, let us go back to the original promise. You give us our independence, our Dominion status. Well, this did put cat amongst the pigeons, if I may use that expression. But they very quickly found a good answer. They said, we have already raised loans for this new federation. We want quite a lot of finance. All countries need finance. I mean, even South Africa, with all of their riches, etc., you want finance to keep on building up the strength of the country. Now, they said, if we do that, people will say to us, people who've given us loans, wait a minute, what's all this about? I mean, if you're talking about what happens if the federation breaks up, well, then we want to know what's going to happen to the guarantees which we have been given. We will lose those, won't we? And they made a very good point. So I had to accept that in keeping with the undertaking given, the federation could not be dissolved and would not be dissolved. But tragically, the British changed their minds. And this was because Kaunda, who was then the Prime Minister of Northern Rhodesia, and Dr. Hastings Banda from Nyasaland, as it was then called, Malawi today, they had made it quite clear that they weren't going to go along with this. They were going to walk out. So we had to face up to this fact that we who had had our virtual independence for 50 years, I think it was 1923, when the British government decided that they were going to break Rhodes's charter. He had a charter from the old Queen, was it Elizabeth? Victoria. Or Victoria, Queen Victoria, sorry, who said, look, if we break this, then you are going to destroy everything that we have believed in the past and stood for in the past. So I support this. We're not going to break this. We cannot break it until the British government changed their mind and decided that they wanted to break it. So they then set up a special committee to look into the breakup of the Federation, with a special minister from Britain who was sent to assist in the breakup. Well, all of these things were contrary to what we had been led to believe and we had been promised, and it was very difficult for me to argue against those facts when I knew how strongly the British government felt and that they had a case. What's going to happen if we breach the agreement and all of the arrangements for finance, etc., are abrogated. That's not on. The British government will not accept that. So that was a situation in which I found myself. I'm a Rhodesian. Fortunately, although my forebears came originally from Britain, my mother's side from Cumberland, my father's side from Scotland, I was born in Rhodesia. So I've always been a Rhodesian, and that's the way I'm going to stay. There have been 5 generations of my family in Rhodesia. If you go to the little cemetery, the graveyard in Selukwe, my hometown where I was born, you will see there is a grave there where my grandfather is buried. This man who came out of the Boer War was a mining engineer. There are 2 graves with my mother and father. My mother, John Douglas Smith, MBE, he had been decorated, and ED, which was an efficiency decoration for his services to the security. And alongside him, my mother, who was also MBE. So quite a coincidence that the 2 of them are there, buried side by side. We had always been the first to fight for Britain, because we were part of Britain. We were part of the British Commonwealth. I'm repeating myself here. We believed in Rhodes's dream of the famous charter company of expanding the red dream of Rhodes from the Cape to Cairo. One of the tragedies of our country was that in 1923, when the old Queen decided that she was going to do away with any British influence, we were given a choice. We could either stay as part of Rhodes's dream, as part of that charter company, or we could join South Africa as an additional province of South Africa. I wasn't part of that. I remember hearing my old father saying to me, no, we weren't prepared to accept that, because in spite of the fact that General Smuts came up here with all of his wonderful charm and charisma and brilliance, he said we liked Smuts, but most of the South Africans were Afrikaans-speaking people, and that was contrary to our British tradition. We were only British, we were only English, and so we rejected that. I repeat, sadly, because I remember Sir Robert Menzies, who was the Prime Minister of Australia, saying to me, he was a member of Churchill's war cabinet, I think there were only 5 of them at the time, who helped him plot in the strategy for our World War, the Second World War. And he said to me, Smuts was such an outstanding man, a brilliant man, with so much balance and experience. We always liked to listen to him and hear his views before making a final decision. And that was the opinion of all of us. Smuts was a brilliant student who started his career on the west coast of Africa, a place called Malmesbury, just a few miles out of Cape Town. He matriculated when he was 14, but most of the other people were 16. He went to Stellenbosch University, and he took his degree there in a couple of years, which other students would take in 4 years. But they could not hold him back. He refused to hold back. And as soon as he got his degree, he went to Cambridge, which was unusual because most of the South Africans were associated with Rhodes and Rhodes Scholars, which operated in Oxford. He went to Cambridge. He was so brilliant there that they erected a memento to him because he took his degree in less time than anybody else, and that is still there today. And there is a statue in Trafalgar Square. Many people think it's an undesirable one, not a very attractive one, to Smuts, just outside South Africa House. So with that kind of history, I don't have to remind you of how strongly we felt about our links with Britain and the fact that we were prepared to fight for Britain right to the end and defend our traditions, our culture, and the sort of things that we believed in. I mean, Harold Wilson once told me when we were on battleships talking about our independence on the Mediterranean that he had received a very strong message saying, "You dare not interfere with this country." Maybe I'm repeating myself today. This is what I've said before. Because if you do, the British troops will not accept that. When they think of the loyalty of Rhodesia and how they've always been part of helping us in Aden and those parts of the world, no ways. British generals in charge have said, "We want to warn you, the troops will not accept that." So that was Rhodesia. We were satisfied it was the best choice because for the first time in our history, people were beginning to leave our country. There was a skills and a brains drain. First of all, it was the people from Kenya who had been sent there and told, "You must stay there. We want you to stay in the White Highlands and produce coffee," and those sort of things. But they had got a message from the British saying, "That's off. We're going to hand you over to Kenyatta and the Mau Mau." Well, they came down through Rhodesia. They didn't stay in Rhodesia. They were on their way to South Africa. And many of them, some of their people went to different parts of the world, like Australia and so on. A lot of Rhodesians and South Africans went to Australia. At one stage I was told around about Perth there were more South Africans and Rhodesians than were Australians. Might have been a bit of an exaggeration. But that was the kind of situation in which we found ourselves. So we were not going to deviate from what we believed was right. And what we were told was our mission in life, to go on protecting the great things of the British Commonwealth and what we had always believed in and what we were told we were going to preserve, we were going to keep going. Something which Harold Wilson himself repeated to me, excuse me, when we were on those battleships talking off Gibraltar. He said to me, "There's nothing I would like more than to come to an agreement with you." But he said, 3 of my cabinet ministers have threatened me that if I make an agreement with you, they will walk out. They will betray me. They will condemn me. So he said, "I want to try to avoid it. Nothing will give me greater pleasure in my life than making this agreement with you and ensuring that we can fulfill my great ambition." He had a wonderful secretary who worked with him there, Marcia Williams, her name was. She subsequently became Lady someone or other. I'm not quite sure who it was, but she was given that title by Harold Wilson. She was obviously very skilled, competent. If anybody wanted anything, she would produce it in a flash. And she subsequently wrote her memoirs. And she pointed out there how much she appreciated her contacts with me and how we had many conversations where we had made agreements and come to conclusions which she thought were in the interests of the British Commonwealth. And I appreciated that very much. So I was convinced that what we were doing was correct, because history proved that from the time we declared our independence, then the scene changed, and instead of people leaving, we were getting people coming back. Instead of a drain of investment started coming back to our country. So I think there are facts which substantiate the point that I make, that we were a leading part of the British Commonwealth, and what we wanted to do was to perpetuate the theme of Rhodesia being this wonderful loyal country where we had more troops proportional to population than any other country in the Commonwealth. So there was no doubt in my mind, and no doubt in the minds of many of my supporters. People like Brigadier Dunlop, who had a DSO and who was a paratrooper from his war. We had Colonel Allen, who was a DSO and 2 bars. Now that's an incredible high rate of decoration from the northeast part of India. And according to our information, his commander, his regimental commander, had recommended him for a Victoria Cross. But he lost out because they had already had one, and one was their quota for that year. So when you had people like that who were working with you and helping you fight for what you believed in, there was a great impetus for us to go on. I had to point out to the British government that they never had one person in the whole of their cabinet who had one decoration. And when I mentioned the wonderful decorations which our people had, it was a serious blow to their situation, I suppose, their pride, if they had any pride. So that was how things went for us. Fortunately, we always had very good race relations in our country. We'd never had problems with blacks against whites. There was one situation where the Matabeles, they're the strong people from the west of the country, the forebears of Lobengula and Msilukazi, who were offshoots of the Zulus from Natal. They came up there once because they had a fight which was inconclusive up in the northern Transvaal. Excuse me. And there was a rule with the Zulus that if you didn't win, when you came back home, there was only one thing that happened to you, and that was an unpleasant thing. So they decided they were not going to go back home. They just moved north. They came north through northern Transvaal and eventually got to the borders of what was then Bechuanaland and what was then Rhodesia, Matabele land. And well, that was just our history. We weren't going to deviate from that. I remember on one occasion, going back to my association with Harold Wilson, what a wonderful association I had with him. I was passing through London. And in those days, I was a minister in a transitional government. In fact, I was deputy leader. And there were only, I think, 6 members of the Commonwealth who were given the privilege of being part of that great British Empire, which hinged on keeping all the people together. And I was given VIP attention in a lounge at the airport, Heathrow. There was somebody at the door. I don't know why he was there, because I certainly didn't need any security protection, but I think it was just to ensure that nobody tried to get silly. I was sitting down, I had everything available, I had drinks. I think might have been having a Scotch whiskey. I'm not a great drinker, but occasionally that's a nice thing to have. When the chap at the door said, "There's a man out here who says he wants to see you. Says he's an old friend of yours." Oh, I said, "Who is he? Go and ask him what his name is." So he went to the door and he came back and he said, "His name is Harold Wilson." I said, "Bring him in." He came in, he put his arms around me. And that was the close connection that we had, and how I trusted Harold Wilson, because he was a socialist and we were basically free enterprise. But we knew where we stood, and he was far loyaler to me than some of the conservatives who were supposed to be our friends and who were gradually slipping the knife in our back when we were least expecting it. And I think I'm repeating myself, that probably the worst of them all was Carrington, who sadly made a fool of himself over the Falklands issue, but it was too late by then for, I think it was Margaret Thatcher, to change her mind. Well, you've got to face the facts of history. We're living with our history, and history that had been given to us, remember, by the British government. That constitution was handed to us by the British government. It wasn't one imposed by Rhodesians themselves. And I can recall very clearly members of the British government saying the land was divided into 3 categories. There was land which was set aside for the black people, 1/3. Land which was set aside for the not so much the Europeans as the commercial farmers, 1/3. And then trust land in between, when you could take land from that for odd things to back up one of the other factions. At one stage, the chiefs in Rhodesia said to us, look, we want more land because we've got more people now. And they say, can we have some more land? I was on a committee as a young member of Parliament, and we looked into this. It was very clear that they needed more land because there were more people. The reason why there were more people was that they weren't dying of disease, because the white man had stopped them dying of disease by producing remedies for things like malaria and other communicated diseases. So we agreed. Excuse me. And I believe if we are given an opportunity to explain why we did these things, there is no doubt that we were doing what was in the best interest of the people. For example, what would have happened if we hadn't gone on producing this